The black sedan pulled up to the gates of Buckingham Palace on a crisp November morning, its windows tinted dark enough to hide the occupants inside. Security guards straightened their postures as they recognized the diplomatic plates, though none of them could have predicted the chaos that would unfold in the next few minutes. Donald Trump Jr. stepped out of the vehicle with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. His expensive Italian shoes clicked against the cobblestones as he adjusted his silk tie and smoothed back his perfectly styled hair. Behind him, his entourage of 3 assistants and a personal photographer hurried to keep pace, their arms full of briefcases and camera equipment. The 28-year-old had arrived in London as part of what his father's administration called a diplomatic goodwill tour, though most observers understood it to be little more than an expensive vacation disguised as official business. Junior had spent the previous week bouncing between luxury hotels in Paris and Rome, attending charity galas and business meetings that seemed to accomplish little beyond generating photo opportunities for his social media accounts. As they approached the palace's main entrance, Junior's assistant, a nervous young woman named Sarah, whispered something urgent in his ear. She had been trying all morning to explain the proper protocol for meeting members of the royal family, but Junior had dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. He was an American, he had reminded her, and Americans didn't bow to anyone. The massive oak doors of the palace swung open to reveal a line of impeccably dressed staff members waiting to receive their guests. The butler, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and a perfectly pressed uniform, stepped forward with a practiced smile. He had served 3 generations of royals and had welcomed countless world leaders, celebrities, and dignitaries through these very doors. Junior's eyes immediately locked onto the royal guard standing at attention along the palace corridors. Their red uniforms were pristine, their tall black hats perfectly aligned, and their faces showed no expression whatsoever. These were the elite soldiers who protected the crown, men who had earned their positions through years of rigorous training and unwavering dedication to duty. Something about the sight of these soldiers triggered an unexpected reaction in Junior's mind. Perhaps it was the way they stood so perfectly still, or maybe it was the obvious respect they commanded from everyone around them. Whatever the reason, he suddenly felt entitled to the same level of reverence. After all, wasn't he the son of the most powerful man in the world? The butler began his formal welcome, explaining the schedule for the day and the various protocols that would need to be followed during their visit. Junior nodded along, but his attention remained fixed on the guards. He studied their movements, their bearing, and most importantly, the way everyone else in the palace seemed to automatically defer to their presence. As they walked deeper into the palace, Junior's photographer began snapping pictures of everything in sight. The ornate chandeliers, the priceless paintings, the elaborate tapestries that had hung on these walls for centuries. All of it would make excellent content for Junior's Instagram account back home. His followers loved seeing glimpses of his privileged lifestyle, and this palace tour would certainly give them something to talk about. But Junior's mind was elsewhere. He was formulating a plan, one that would give him the ultimate photo opportunity and prove to everyone back home just how important he really was. If these guards could command such respect and admiration, then surely the son of the American president deserved even more. The idea that was forming in his head seemed perfectly reasonable to him, though anyone else might have recognized it as the product of a dangerously inflated ego. The butler continued his guided tour, pointing out various historical artifacts and sharing stories about the palace's rich history. Junior's assistants dutifully took notes and asked appropriate questions, but their boss seemed distracted. He kept glancing back at the guards they passed, studying their movements and seeming to calculate something in his head. As they approached the grand staircase, Junior suddenly stopped walking. His entire entourage came to an abrupt halt behind him, unsure of what had captured his attention. The butler turned around with a concerned expression, wondering if something was wrong with their distinguished guest. Junior's eyes were fixed on a pair of royal guards who stood flanking the bottom of the staircase. These particular soldiers had been selected for this duty because of their exceptional records and unwavering discipline. They had served in combat zones around the world, earned numerous commendations, and dedicated their lives to protecting the crown. To them, this was not just a job, It was a sacred duty that they took more seriously than anything else in their lives. The young Trump heir took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. This was his moment, he decided. This was when he would show everyone exactly who he was and what kind of respect he deserved. The fact that he was about to make one of the most embarrassing mistakes of his life had not yet occurred to him. His photographer raised his camera, ready to capture whatever was about to happen. Sarah, his assistant, sensed that something was wrong but couldn't quite put her finger on what it might be. The butler watched with growing concern as Junior began, walking toward the two guards with a strange expression on his face. The palace corridors fell silent, except for the sound of Junior's footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Even the other tourists and staff members seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen, though none of them could have predicted just how spectacular the coming disaster would be. Junior approached the two royal guards with the swagger of someone who had never been denied anything in his life. His Italian leather shoes made sharp clicking sounds against the polished marble floor, each step echoing through the grand corridor like a countdown to disaster. The guards remained perfectly motionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead, their rifles held at precise angles that spoke of countless hours of training and discipline. Standing directly in front of the first guard, Junior cleared his throat loudly and placed his hands on his hips in what he clearly believed was an authoritative pose. The guard, a decorated veteran named Sergeant Williams who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, continued staring straight ahead without the slightest acknowledgement of Junior's presence. This was exactly what his training had taught him to do, but Junior interpreted the lack of response as disrespect rather than protocol. "Excuse me," Junior said, his voice carrying the entitled tone of someone who expected immediate attention. "I'm Donald Trump Jr., son of the President of the United States. I'm here on official diplomatic business, and I believe some recognition is in order." The butler, who had been watching this exchange with growing horror, quickly stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Junior's arm. "Sir, if I may explain, the royal guards are not permitted to break their formation or acknowledge visitors during their duty. It's a matter of protocol that goes back centuries." Junior shrugged off the butler's hand with obvious irritation. He had not traveled thousands of miles and spent countless taxpayer dollars on this trip, just to be ignored by a couple of soldiers in funny hats. In his mind, these guards were no different from the Secret Service agents who protected his father, and those men always showed him proper respect. "Listen," Junior said, raising his voice slightly. "I don't think you understand who I am. My father is the leader of the free world. These guards should be saluting me just like they would salute any other high-ranking official." Sarah, his assistant, felt her stomach drop as she realized where this conversation was heading. She had tried to brief Junior on British customs and royal protocol during the flight from Rome, but he had spent most of the journey on his phone, posting selfies and responding to comments on his social media accounts. Now she watched helplessly as her boss prepared to make an international incident out of his own ignorance. The second guard, Lance Corporal Davies, was a man who had earned his position through 15 years of exemplary service. He had protected members of the royal family during state visits, stood watch during terrorist threats, and maintained his post through blazing summer heat and bitter winter cold. Nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for dealing with an entitled American tourist who seemed to believe that royal protocol should bend to accommodate his ego. Junior's photographer, sensing that something dramatic was about to unfold, began snapping pictures rapidly. The camera's flash reflected off the guards' polished buttons and the gleaming marble walls, creating a strobe light effect that made the entire scene feel surreal. Other visitors to the palace had begun to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the commotion but unsure of what they were witnessing. "I'm waiting," Junior announced loudly, his voice now carrying clearly throughout the corridor. "I expect these guards to show proper respect to a representative of the United States government." The butler's face had gone pale, and he could feel perspiration beginning to form on his forehead, despite the palace's carefully controlled temperature. In his 40 years of service, he had never encountered a situation quite like this one. World leaders, movie stars, and even the most eccentric billionaires had all managed to observe basic protocol during their visits. This young American seemed determined to create a scene that would embarrass everyone involved. Sergeant Williams, despite his training in remaining motionless, was beginning to feel the strain of the situation. His eyes remained fixed on the point directly ahead of him, but he could sense the growing crowd of onlookers and the tension that was building in the air around him. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown and maintain the dignity of his position, and nothing this spoiled young man could say or do would make him break that oath. Junior's frustration was becoming more obvious by the minute. His face was beginning to flush red, and his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. The idea that anyone would dare to ignore him was so foreign to his experience that he simply couldn't process what was happening. In his world, money and connections opened every door and commanded every form of respect. "This is ridiculous," Junior declared, his voice now loud enough to echo off the vaulted ceiling. "I demand that these guards acknowledge my presence and show proper respect for my position." The butler made one more desperate attempt to defuse the situation. "Sir, perhaps we could continue with the tour and discuss this matter privately later. I'm sure we can arrange for some appropriate photographs to commemorate your visit." But Junior was beyond reasoning with at this point. His ego had been challenged, and his privileged upbringing had never taught him how to handle such situations with grace or dignity. Instead of accepting the butler's diplomatic solution, he decided to escalate the confrontation even further. "No," Junior said firmly, "I'm not moving from this spot until these guards give me the salute I deserve." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and several people had begun recording the scene with their phones. Junior's assistant Sarah realized with growing dread that videos of this confrontation would probably be uploaded to social media within minutes, creating an international embarrassment that would be impossible to contain. The guards continued to stand perfectly still, their training and discipline serving as an unshakable foundation against Junior's demands. They had sworn oaths that meant more to them than any amount of political pressure or entitled behavior. The contrast between their quiet dignity and Junior's loud demands was becoming more stark with each passing moment. Junior took another step closer to Sergeant Williams, now standing so close that the guard could probably feel his breath. "I'm talking to you," he said in a voice that was barely controlled. "The least you can do is show some respect." The tension in the palace corridor had reached a breaking point. Junior stood mere inches from Sergeant Williams, his face growing redder by the second as he waited for acknowledgement that would never come. The guard's unwavering discipline was like a mirror reflecting Junior's own lack of self-control, and the contrast was becoming more embarrassing with each passing moment. "I said I'm talking to you," Junior shouted, his voice cracking slightly with frustration. The sound echoed through the grand hallway, bouncing off centuries-old portraits of kings and queens who seemed to stare down at the scene with disapproval. Several elderly tourists gasped at the outburst, while others began whispering among themselves about the spectacle unfolding before them. The butler had exhausted his diplomatic options and was now genuinely afraid that this situation might escalate into an international incident. He could already imagine the headlines that would appear in tomorrow's newspapers, and none of them would be flattering to either the palace or the American delegation. His years of training in crisis management had never covered a scenario quite like this one. Sarah, Junior's assistant, was frantically typing on her phone, trying to reach someone from the American embassy who might be able to intervene before this disaster spiraled completely out of control. Her hands were shaking as she scrolled through her contacts, knowing that her own career might be over if she couldn't find a way to extract her boss from this self-created nightmare. Junior's photographer had stopped taking pictures, finally realizing that these images would never see the light of day on any official social media account. Instead, he was trying to make himself invisible, hoping that somehow he wouldn't be associated with whatever was about to happen next. The camera hung uselessly around his neck like a millstone of his own complicity. Lance Corporal Davies, the second guard, was fighting every instinct in his body that told him to step in and defend his fellow soldier, but his training was absolute, and breaking formation would only make the situation worse. He could see the strain on Sergeant Williams' face, though the casual observer would never notice the subtle signs of stress that only another soldier would recognize. The crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly 30 people, including several families with children who were witnessing what would probably become the most memorable part of their palace visit for all the wrong reasons. Some of the adults were trying to shield their children's eyes, not from violence, but from the sheer embarrassment of watching a grown man throw what could only be described as a public tantrum. Junior's frustration finally boiled over into something approaching rage. "Do you know who I am?" he screamed at the motionless guard. "My father could have you fired with a single phone call." He could shut down this whole tourist trap if he wanted to. The absurdity of the threat was lost on Junior, but not on anyone else present. The idea that an American president could somehow shut down Buckingham Palace demonstrated such a fundamental misunderstanding of international relations that several of the onlookers began exchanging incredulous glances. Even the children in the crowd seemed to sense that something was very wrong with this picture. Sergeant Williams remained perfectly still, though a tiny muscle in his jaw twitched almost imperceptibly. He had served his country in combat zones where he had faced actual life-and-death situations with less stress than he was feeling at this moment. The weight of maintaining his dignity while being berated by this spoiled young man was testing his resolve in ways that enemy fire never had. The butler made one final attempt to restore order to the situation. "Sir, I must insist that we move along with the tour. There are other guests waiting and we have a schedule to maintain." Junior whirled around to face the butler, his eyes wild with indignation. "I don't care about your schedule. I don't care about your other guests. These guards are going to salute me right now, or I'm going to make sure everyone knows how poorly the British treat American dignitaries." The threat was empty, of course, but it revealed the depth of Junior's delusion about his own importance and influence. He genuinely believed that his tantrum was justified, that he was the victim of some kind of deliberate slight rather than the author of his own humiliation. The ability to see himself clearly had been bred out of him by years of privilege and uncritical praise. A security camera mounted high on the corridor wall continued recording every moment of the confrontation, its silent witness ensuring that this scene would be preserved for posterity, whether Junior wanted it to be or not. Somewhere in a control room, Palace security personnel were probably debating whether to intervene or simply let this play out to its inevitable conclusion. The other members of Junior's entourage had begun backing away from their boss, creating a small circle of empty space around him that made his isolation even more apparent. They had all signed non-disclosure agreements as part of their employment, but nothing in those contracts could prevent them from feeling second-hand embarrassment at this public meltdown. Junior turned back to face the guards, his breathing heavy and his expensive suit now wrinkled from his agitated movements. "This is your last chance," he announced in a voice that was meant to sound threatening but came across as desperate. "Salute me now or face the consequences." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the normal sounds of the palace seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. The guards remained motionless, their commitment to duty unwavering despite the increasingly unhinged demands being made of them. Junior's face had now turned an alarming shade of purple, and small beads of sweat were beginning to form on his forehead. The realization that his threats and demands were having absolutely no effect was starting to penetrate even his ego-addled consciousness. But instead of backing down gracefully, he seemed determined to double down on his unreasonable behavior. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "If you won't show me respect voluntarily, then I'll just have to demand it." What happened next would be talked about in palace circles for years to come, though most of the staff who witnessed it would wish they could forget it entirely. Junior drew himself up to his full height and planted his feet in what he clearly believed was an authoritative stance. The silence in the corridor was so complete that the ticking of an antique clock somewhere in the distance sounded like thunder. Every eye in the growing crowd was focused on him, waiting to see what new depths of embarrassment he might reach. "Attention," Junior barked in his loudest voice, attempting to mimic the commanding tone he had heard in military movies. The word echoed off the marble walls and vaulted ceiling, but the two royal guards remained as motionless as statues. Their training had prepared them for many scenarios, but being shouted at by an entitled tourist was somehow more challenging than facing enemy fire. The absurdity of the moment was not lost on anyone except Junior himself. Here was a young man who had never served a day in the military, never earned any rank or distinction through his own merit, attempting to give orders to elite soldiers who had dedicated their lives to service and sacrifice. The disconnect between his perceived authority and his actual status was so vast that several onlookers began to wonder if they were witnessing some kind of elaborate practical joke. "I said, 'Attention,'" Junior repeated, his voice cracking with strain. "When I give an order, I expect it to be followed." His face was now a mottled red and purple color that clashed horribly with his expensive silk tie. The perfectly styled hair that he had spent so much time arranging that morning was beginning to show signs of his agitation, with small strands falling across his forehead. Sergeant Williams continued to stare straight ahead, though every muscle in his body was tense with the effort of maintaining his composure. He had been insulted by drunken tourists, provoked by political protesters, and tested by curious children, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this level of entitled behavior. The young American's complete lack of understanding about military protocol and royal tradition was almost breathtaking in its ignorance. The butler was now visibly perspiring, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of the stress he was experiencing. He had served 3 monarchs and countless world leaders, but this situation was unlike anything in his extensive experience. The diplomatic implications of what was happening were staggering, and he could already imagine the difficult conversations he would need to have with his superiors later. That day. Junior's photographer had given up any pretense of documenting this visit and was instead trying to blend into the background. The camera that had seemed so important just minutes earlier now felt like evidence of his participation in this disaster. He found himself hoping that no one would remember he was part of Junior's entourage when the inevitable investigation into this incident began. "You will salute me," Junior screamed, his voice now so high-pitched that it was almost painful to hear. "I am the son of the President of the United States, and I demand the respect that my position deserves." Lance Corporal Davies, who had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation, felt a slight twitch in his left eye. It was the only outward sign of the tremendous self-control he was exercising in the face of Junior's increasingly deranged behavior. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown and maintain the dignity of his uniform, and no amount of American entitlement would make him break that sacred commitment. The crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly 50 people, including several palace staff members who had been drawn by the commotion. Some were openly staring in amazement, while others were trying to pretend they weren't witnessing this spectacular meltdown. A few people were discreetly recording the scene with their phones, ensuring that Junior's tantrum would be preserved for posterity and probably shared across social media within hours. Sarah, Junior's assistant, was now openly crying as she continued her frantic attempts to reach someone who might be able to intervene. Her phone calls to the embassy were going straight to voicemail, and her text messages to other staff members were being ignored. She realized with growing horror that she was completely alone in trying to manage this crisis, and that her boss was beyond any form of reasonable intervention. Junior took another step closer to Sergeant Williams, now standing so close that he was almost touching the guard's immaculate red uniform. "Look at me," he demanded, his voice raw from shouting. "I'm talking to you. The least you can do is acknowledge my presence." The guard's eyes remained fixed on the point directly ahead of him, just as his training had taught him. He had been taught to treat all visitors with equal dignity and respect, but also to maintain his post regardless of any attempts at provocation. The young American's behavior was certainly the most extreme test of this principle he had ever encountered, but his resolve remained unshakable. "This is ridiculous," Junior shouted, throwing his hands up in frustration. "In America, when someone of my stature walks into a room, people show respect. They stand up. They pay attention. They salute." The statement revealed so much about Junior's worldview and his complete misunderstanding of how respect actually works. The idea that deference should be automatically granted based on family connections rather than earned through personal achievement was so foreign to the guards' value system that they couldn't have responded even if their training had allowed. The butler made one last, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Sir, perhaps if you would allow me to explain the historical significance of the guards' duties, you might better understand why they cannot respond to your requests." Junior spun around to face the butler, his eyes wild with rage and frustration. "I don't want explanations. I don't want history lessons. I want these guards to show me the respect I deserve right now." The sheer volume of his voice caused several small children in the crowd to start crying, which only added to the chaos and embarrassment of the moment. Their parents quickly ushered them away from the scene, leaving behind only the adults who were too fascinated by this train wreck to tear themselves away. Junior turned back to face the guards one final time, his breathing heavy and his clothes disheveled from his agitated movements. "Fine," he said in a voice that was supposed to sound threatening but came across as petulant. "If you won't salute me voluntarily, then I'll just have to make you do it." What Junior did next would ensure that his name would be remembered in palace history for all the wrong reasons. In a moment that would be talked about for decades to come, Junior reached out with both hands and actually grabbed Sergeant Williams by the shoulders, attempting to physically turn the guard to face him. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible throughout the corridor, as 50 people witnessed what was probably the most serious breach of protocol in the palace's modern history. The guard's training immediately kicked in. Without breaking his stoic expression or changing his gaze, Sergeant Williams shifted his weight slightly and used a subtle defensive technique to break Junior's grip without causing any harm. The movement was so smooth and professional that most observers barely noticed it, but Junior stumbled backward, more from surprise than from any force applied by the guard. "Sir," the butler shouted, his diplomatic composure finally cracking under the pressure. "You absolutely cannot touch the royal guards. This is completely unacceptable behavior." But Junior was beyond hearing reason at this point. The physical contact with the guard had somehow convinced him that he was making progress, that he was finally getting the attention he deserved. His face was flushed with what he mistook for victory, though everyone else recognized it as the look of someone who had completely lost touch with reality. "There," Junior declared triumphantly, pointing at Sergeant Williams. "Now you have to acknowledge me. I've made contact. You can't just ignore me anymore." The logic was so twisted and delusional that several people in the crowd began to wonder if Junior might be experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. The idea that physically grabbing a guard would somehow force him to break protocol demonstrated such a fundamental misunderstanding of military discipline that it was almost pitiful to witness. Palace security, who had been monitoring the situation from their control room, finally decided that intervention was necessary. 3 uniformed officers began making their way toward the scene, their movements calm but purposeful. They had dealt with unruly tourists before, but never one with such high-profile connections or such spectacular behavior. Sarah, Junior's assistant, saw the security guards approaching and felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that someone was finally going to put an end to this nightmare, but terror at the thought of her boss being arrested or detained in a foreign country. The diplomatic implications were staggering, and she knew that her own career was probably over, regardless of how this situation was resolved. Junior, oblivious to the approaching security personnel, was now pacing back and forth in front of the 2 guards like a caged animal. "I don't understand why this is so difficult," he muttered, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "All I want is a simple salute. Is that too much to ask?" The question was addressed to no one in particular, but the irony was lost on him completely. What he was asking for was not simple at all. It was a fundamental violation of centuries of tradition and military protocol. The fact that he couldn't grasp this concept revealed the depth of his privilege and entitlement. Lance Corporal Davies, who had witnessed his fellow guard being physically accosted, was fighting every instinct in his body that told him to step in and protect his comrade. But his training held firm, and he remained at his post, though the strain was beginning to show in the slight tension around his eyes. The approaching security guards moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, politely asking onlookers to step aside while keeping their attention focused on Junior. Their presence had an immediate calming effect on the crowd, but Junior remained completely absorbed in his own drama and hadn't noticed them yet. "You know what?" Junior announced suddenly, his voice carrying clearly throughout the corridor. "If these guards won't salute me, then maybe I need to show them how it's done." To the horror of everyone present, Junior actually attempted to demonstrate what he thought a proper military salute should look like. His form was laughably incorrect. His hand was positioned wrong, his posture was all over the place, and his timing was completely off. It was like watching someone try to perform surgery based on what they had seen in movies. "There," he said proudly, holding his mangled salute for several seconds. "That's how you show respect to a superior officer. Now I expect the same courtesy in return." The guards remained motionless, their professionalism unwavering even in the face of this absurd display. Their actual military training made Junior's amateur attempt at a salute even more insulting, though they showed no outward reaction to his performance. The lead security guard was now close enough to speak, and he approached Junior with the kind of calm authority that comes from years of experience dealing with difficult situations. "Sir," he said in a firm but respectful voice, I'm going to need you to step away from the guards and come with me." Junior whirled around to face the security officer, his eyes wide with indignation. "Are you kidding me?" he demanded. "I'm being arrested for asking for basic respect? This is outrageous." "You're not being arrested, sir," the security guard replied patiently. "But you are being asked to leave this area immediately. Your behavior is disrupting other visitors and violating palace protocol." The word protocol seemed to trigger another wave of rage in Junior. "Protocol?" he screamed. "What about the protocol of showing respect to visiting dignitaries? What about the protocol of treating American officials with dignity?" The security guard remained calm in the face of Junior's outburst, though his colleagues had positioned themselves strategically around the group to ensure that the situation didn't escalate further. They had dealt with many difficult visitors over the years, but few had managed to create such a spectacular scene in such a short period of time. Junior's photographer, who had been trying to remain invisible throughout the entire incident, was now actively backing away from the group, hoping to distance himself from whatever was about to happen next. The camera around his neck felt like a weight of guilt, and he found himself wishing he had chosen a different career entirely. The butler, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly, stepped forward to address the security guards. "Officers, this gentleman is part of an official diplomatic delegation. Perhaps we could handle this matter privately?" But Junior was having none of it. "No," he shouted. "I want everyone to see how the British treat American dignitaries. This is going to be an international incident." The threat was empty, of course, but it revealed the depth of Junior's delusion about his own importance and the consequences of his behavior. He genuinely believed that his tantrum would somehow be seen as justified, that the world would rally to his defense once they learned how he had been mistreated. The reality, of course, was exactly the opposite. The lead security officer maintained his professional demeanor, despite Junior's increasingly erratic behavior. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice and come with me immediately. We can discuss this matter in a private setting where we won't disturb other visitors." Junior's response was to throw what could only be described as a full-blown tantrum. "I'm not going anywhere until these guards salute me," he screamed, his voice echoing off the ancient walls. "Do you understand me? I'm not moving from this spot." To emphasize his point, Junior actually sat down on the marble floor in front of the guards, crossing his legs like a petulant child refusing to leave a toy store. The sight of a grown man in an expensive suit staging a sit-in protest in one of the world's most prestigious palaces was so surreal that several onlookers began to wonder if they were witnessing some kind of elaborate performance. The crowd had grown to nearly 70 people now, including palace staff, tourists, and even a few members of the media who had been covering other events at the palace. Phones and cameras were discreetly recording every moment of Junior's meltdown, ensuring that his behavior would be preserved and shared across the internet within hours. Sarah, his assistant, was now sobbing openly as she realized that there was absolutely nothing she could do to save her boss from himself. Her phone had finally connected her to someone at the American embassy, and she was trying to explain the situation while Junior continued his tantrum just a few feet away. "He's sitting on the floor," she whispered into her phone, her voice breaking with emotion. "He's actually sitting on the floor of Buckingham Palace demanding that the royal guard salute him. I don't know what to do." The embassy official on the other end of the line was initially skeptical, assuming that Sarah must be exaggerating the situation. But as she continued to describe the scene in detail, the gravity of the diplomatic crisis began to sink in. This was exactly the kind of international embarrassment that could strain relationships between allied nations. Junior, meanwhile, was showing no signs of backing down from his bizarre protest. "I'll sit here all day if I have to," he announced to anyone who would listen. "I'll sit here until these guards show me the respect I deserve." The two royal guards continued to stand at perfect attention, though the strain of maintaining their composure in the face of such unprecedented behavior was beginning to show in subtle ways. Sergeant Williams had developed a slight tremor in his left hand, while Lance Corporal Davies was blinking more frequently than usual. Both men were experienced soldiers who had faced enemy fire without flinching, but this situation was testing their discipline in ways they had never imagined. The butler was now in full crisis management mode, trying to coordinate with security while minimizing the diplomatic fallout from Junior's behavior. He had sent urgent messages to his superiors and was already preparing for the difficult conversations that would need to take place with both. British and American officials, palace security had cordoned off the area around Junior's impromptu protest, creating a buffer zone between him and the growing crowd of spectators. The lead officer was speaking quietly into his radio, presumably coordinating with his superiors about how to handle this unprecedented situation. "Sir," the security officer said, crouching down to Junior's level, "you need to understand that your behavior is creating a serious diplomatic incident. I strongly encourage you to reconsider your actions." Junior looked up at the officer with wild eyes, his expensive haircut now completely disheveled and his silk tie askew. "A diplomatic incident?" He laughed, the sound high-pitched and slightly unhinged. "The only incident here is the way I'm being treated. This is discrimination against Americans." The accusation was so absurd that several people in the crowd exchanged incredulous glances. The idea that requesting basic respect for palace protocol constituted discrimination revealed just how disconnected from reality Junior had become. His privileged upbringing had clearly never prepared him for situations where his wishes wouldn't be immediately accommodated. The security officer tried a different approach. "Sir, if you'll come with me, I can arrange for you to speak with someone who might be able to address your concerns in a more appropriate setting." But Junior was beyond reasoning with at this point. "No!" he shouted from his seated position on the floor. "The only thing that will satisfy me is a proper salute from these guards. That's all I've ever asked for." The statement was technically true, but it ignored the fact that what he was asking for was completely impossible given the guards' training and duties. The inability to understand why his request couldn't be granted was perhaps the most telling aspect of his entire meltdown. One of the tourists in the crowd, an elderly gentleman who identified himself as a retired military officer, tried to approach Junior to explain why the guards couldn't respond to his demands. But Junior refused to listen to anyone who wasn't willing to support his position. "You don't understand," Junior told the veteran dismissively. "These guards are being disrespectful to me personally. This isn't about protocol. This is about recognizing my authority as the son of the president." The veteran shook his head sadly and walked away, muttering something about the younger generation's lack of understanding about military service and sacrifice. His brief intervention had only served to highlight the vast gap between Junior's sense of entitlement and the reality of military duty. Junior's photographer had by now completely disappeared from the scene, probably hoping to distance himself from what was turning into a career-ending disaster. The camera that had been intended to capture triumphant moments for Junior's social media accounts had instead documented one of the most embarrassing political incidents in recent memory. The situation had reached a stalemate. Junior showed no signs of backing down from his floor protest. The guards couldn't abandon their posts, and security was reluctant to physically remove someone with such high-profile connections. The crowd continued to grow, and the story was already beginning to spread across social media platforms around the world. Something had to give, and everyone present knew that whatever happened next would have consequences far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. The deadlock was finally broken by the arrival of a senior palace official, a distinguished woman in her 60s, who carried herself with the kind of authority that comes from decades of handling delicate situations. She walked through the crowd with purposeful strides, her face stern but composed, and approached the scene with the confidence of someone who had dealt with far more challenging crises than one entitled American. "Tourist, Mr. Trump," she said in a voice that cut through the noise like a blade. "I am Lady Margaret Thornfield, Deputy Private Secretary to Her Majesty. You will stand up immediately and accompany me to a private office where we can discuss this matter appropriately." There was something in her tone that penetrated even Junior's addled consciousness. For the first time since his tantrum began, he seemed to realize that he might actually be in serious trouble. The use of his surname rather than any honorific title was a deliberate slight that even he couldn't miss, and the woman's obvious authority made it clear that this was not a request. Junior slowly got to his feet, his expensive suit wrinkled and dirty from sitting on the marble floor. His face was still flushed with anger and embarrassment, but some of his earlier bravado had finally begun to fade. The reality of his situation was starting to sink in, though he was far from ready to admit that his behavior had been inappropriate. "Finally," he muttered under his breath, "someone with enough authority to fix this situation." Lady Thornfield heard the comment and fixed him with a stare that could have frozen water. "Mr. Trump, the only situation that needs fixing here is your complete lack of understanding about proper behavior in this palace. You will follow me now, and you will not speak unless spoken to." The crowd began to disperse as security guards gently encouraged onlookers to continue with their tours. The two royal guards remained at their posts, finally able to resume their normal duties now that the distraction had been removed. Sergeant Williams and Lance Corporal Davies maintained their professional composure, though both men would later describe this as one of the most challenging experiences of their military careers. Sarah, Junior's assistant, hurried after her boss and Lady Thornfield, still sobbing quietly as she realized that her diplomatic career was probably over before it had really begun. The phone calls from the embassy had made it clear that this incident would have serious consequences for everyone involved, regardless of their level of responsibility for Junior's behavior. As they walked through the palace corridors toward Lady Thornfield's office, Junior made several attempts to justify his actions or explain his position, but the senior official shut him down each time with a look that could have withered flowers. The contrast between his earlier bluster and his current subdued demeanor was striking to anyone who had witnessed both phases of his visit. Lady Thornfield's office was a model of understated elegance, with portraits of former monarchs looking down from the walls and antique furniture that spoke of centuries of tradition and service. She gestured for Junior to take a seat in a chair positioned directly across from her desk, a setup that made him feel like a schoolchild called to the principal's office. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "your behavior today has been absolutely unacceptable. You have shown complete disrespect for our traditions, our staff, and our guests. More importantly, you have demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be a representative of your country." Junior opened his mouth to respond, but Lady Thornfield held up a hand to silence him. "I am not finished," she said firmly. "The royal guards you attempted to intimidate today are men who have served their country with distinction. They have earned their positions through sacrifice, dedication, and years of exemplary service. The idea that they should salute someone who has done nothing to earn such respect is not only absurd, but deeply insulting to everything they represent." The words hit Junior like physical blows, though his face showed more confusion than comprehension. The concept that respect needed to be earned rather than automatically granted, based on family connections, was so foreign to his experience that he struggled to process what Lady Thornfield was telling him. "Furthermore," she continued, "your complete ignorance of protocol and tradition has created a diplomatic incident that will require considerable effort to resolve. The videos of your tantrum are already spreading across social media, and I suspect that your father's administration will not be pleased with the international embarrassment you have caused." For the first time since the entire incident began, Junior seemed to grasp the potential consequences of his actions. The mention of his father and the administration brought a look of genuine fear to his eyes, as he finally began to understand that his behavior might have repercussions beyond his own immediate situation. Lady Thornfield spent the next 30 minutes explaining exactly what Junior had done wrong, why it was unacceptable, and what the consequences would be. She made it clear that he would be banned from returning to any royal property, that a formal complaint would be filed with the American embassy, and that the incident would be documented in palace records for posterity. By the time the meeting was over, Junior looked like a completely different person from the confident young man who had stepped out of the sedan that morning. His arrogance had been replaced by a kind of shocked bewilderment, as if he was seeing himself clearly for the first time in his life. The ride back to his hotel was conducted in complete silence, with Sarah still crying quietly in the corner of the sedan, and Junior staring out the window with a blank expression. The photographer had been dismissed and told to delete any images from the palace visit, though everyone knew that the damage had already been done through other people's recordings. Within hours, clips of Junior's tantrum were trending on social media platforms around the world. The hashtag #TrumpTantrum became a global phenomenon, with millions of people sharing their own thoughts about privilege, entitlement, and the importance of earning respect rather than demanding it. The incident became a textbook example of how not to behave as a diplomatic representative, and Junior's name was forever associated with one of the most embarrassing breaches of protocol in modern palace history. The royal guards, meanwhile, were quietly commended by their superiors for maintaining their discipline and professionalism under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Years later, tourists visiting Buckingham Palace would still occasionally ask their guides about the infamous incident when an American president's son demanded a salute and ended up learning that privilege doesn't work everywhere. The story became part of palace folklore, a cautionary tale about the difference between inherited status and earned respect. Junior himself rarely spoke about the incident in public, though those close to him said it marked a turning point in his understanding of his place in the world. Whether he actually learned anything from the experience remained a matter of considerable debate, but there was no question that he had provided the world with an unforgettable lesson about the limits of entitlement and the enduring power of dignity and duty.